FAIRtax is coming, don't stand in the way. FAIRtax is coming across the USA. FAIRtax is coming, clean up this mess. We got to get rid of the IRS. Hey, hey! Hey, hey! On April 15th, when you're all out.
Hello and welcome once again to FAIRtax Power Radio. I'm Bob Paxton.
And I'm Ron Malero.
We are the FAIRtax
FAIRtax
Guys. And this is going to be part 3 of our interview with Steve Hayes, the president and chairman of the board of the Americans for Fair Taxation organization. So let's just jump right in here. Part 3 of our interview with Steve Hayes. Oh, yeah. We've seen that movie a lot of times.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting to me because Steve Forbes, I was on some panels with Steve back in the 90s. Steve Forbes is the fellow promoting the flat tax.
He's the flat tax guy, yeah.
And he's actually a very nice man. But he and I used to go after each other a little bit because I was promoting a sales tax, he was promoting a flat tax. Well, he came to Heritage this year, and he gave a talk on the flat tax, and I was there, and he talked about half the time, though, attacking the fair tax. And he did it rather ineptly, meaning he made allegations that were really not very valid.
We've seen that before, too.
But I went up to him afterwards, and Steve kind of looked at me, oh, shoot, like that. Because he hadn't seen me in the audience. I was sitting off to the side. And I said hi to him and told him that I was really pleased that he felt compelled to spend half of his time attacking the fair tax. And he looked at me, and I said, yeah, it's the old principle that Gandhi talked about. There are 4 stages of a successful revolution. The first one is they ignore you. The second stage is they laugh at you. The third stage is they attack you. And the fourth is you win. And I said, looks like I'm getting close to winning.
So we're 75% of the way there.
And he laughed, and we talked some more. But what I used to really irritate Steve with, and Dick Armey got to where he wouldn't even talk to me, was that when we would be in a forum and I would be responding to something he said, I would usually say, if Steve or Dick or whoever the speaker was for the flat tax were king and could assure me that for the next 20 years what he is proposing would stay in place, I'll get behind it today because it's so much better than what we have now. And we can do that today. I'm there.
Mm-hmm.
However, how many of you in the audience believe it'll be like they're proposing it in 5 years, be flat and have this? I'd, dramatically wait and look all over the audience. No hands. And then I would say, okay, how many think in 4 years? Depends on how much time I had. 4 years, and I'd go down to 3. And sometimes around 2, you'd start to see some hands. And at 1, you'd see quite a few hands. And I said, okay, that is what proves my point. The problem is that you're not able to be king, and you're not able to keep this tax the way you propose it. It's going to be like it is now. All the mechanisms are in place for for the lobbyists and everybody to come back in and mess it up again, just like in '86, just like it was in 1913, and then it became more and more and more worse as it went along. Same thing will happen again. We've got to stop this mess, and the only way to do it is to get rid of the income tax, basic taxation, and to go to a consumption tax. And the one to go to is the one that creates the least harm to the economy and it's the easiest, frankly, to collect, and that's the retail sales tax.
All right. I want to go back to this fair thing a bit. So if you listen to a lot of Democratic rhetoric, it's always somebody's not paying their fair share, or it's not fair that Warren Buffett's secretary pays a higher tax rate than Warren Buffett does. How have they reacting to the fact that it is just mathematically impossible for that to happen with a fair tax?
Well, I think that the problem is that most people equate the fair tax with a state sales tax. In other words, they're used to, in 45 states there's a state sales tax, and they're used to seeing the guy who's on welfare next to me and we're both paying the same 6, 7, 8% tax.
Mm-hmm.
And they're saying, well, it's harder on him than it is on you, so therefore it's wrong. And so they don't get the idea there's a prebate. And the way I approach it when I go in is I take it head on when I go talk to Democrats. I say, well, we all agree that all taxes are regressive. And they look at me and I say, yeah, any flat tax, whether it's an income tax or whether it's a sales tax, is a regressive tax because it affects the person with a lower income more than it does with a person with a higher income. It's the same percentage.
Mm-hmm.
And so the income tax spends 77,000 pages trying to make it less of an impact on lower income people so that the people making more money pay more. You have different rates, you have deductions, it's all this confusion. I said, and frankly, the most regressive tax at the federal level you have is the Social Security tax. And they look at me, I said, well, it doesn't matter how many kids you have, it doesn't matter how much income you have, from $1 of earnings you pay Social Security at the same rate, except the guy making more money, he gets to a point, say like I think it's 120 now, where he doesn't pay anymore, he only pays a small percent of Medicare tax. So if you want to talk about regressive taxes, that's the most regressive tax we've got. And they look at me, and by this time people are not disagreeing with me very much. And I said, so what we decided was that we were going to combine and make the best of all the types of taxes. We were going to take a simple tax, which is the sales tax, but we were going to make it where it was very fair and progressive because we were going to allow people who were making up to the poverty level to have no tax, no Social Security, no income tax. They get to keep all that money and they get to spend. Plus, if we have prices go down even 10%, they've got a 10% boost in purchasing power. So that family making $30,000 can now buy $33,000 worth of goods and pay zero tax. So we have managed to do that through this prebate system, and I explained the prebate. Mm-hmm. And a lot of times that regressive argument goes away. Now, I've had one guy come up and say, well, I still don't think it's right because the guy making $1 million is only paying 23%. And I said, well, okay, what is it you think we should do? Well, I want a wealth tax, and I want a higher tax rate on incomes, and I want a lower deduction for estate tax, and I want to increase the rate on estates over $2 million or some number like that. And I said, all right, that's good. Now, what's going to happen if you get that through? This was about a year ago, I had this conversation with a rather liberal economist, and he said, we'll get it through, and I said, all right, what's going to happen when the Republicans take over, if they do, because it tends to go back and forth? Mm-hmm. What's going to happen to your wealth tax? What's going to happen to the estate tax? What's going to happen to all this? I said, it's going to get reversed. And the constituency that you're representing, I'm assuming his name was Jared Bernstein, in that $50,000 to $60,000 earning, the great middle of the country, are really not going to have much attention on this because they don't really see how it affects them. And he looked at me and I said, okay, now let's say you did this though. Let's say you took the sales tax, and instead of saying you had a $30,000 exemption, $32,000 for a family of 4, let's say you had a $50,000. So all the money they earned up to $50,000 and spent, zero tax. No Social Security, no income tax. Now what's going to happen is you're going to have to raise the rate to probably not 23, but maybe 33%. Mm-hmm. So all those people making over $50,000 are going to pay a higher rate. And the people that are spending a lot of money, up 150, 200,000 earners, are going to be paying the full rate almost all the way. And be more permanent, because if you give that benefit to that huge number of people, how are you going to take it away? And he looked at me and he says, give me your card. Now, he's not on board in the sense that he's not out touting this. He'd still like to do the wealth tax and all that. Mm-hmm. But it's something that they really can't argue with if they're really sincerely wanting to help that group of people, because None of them will argue that a consumption-based tax isn't going to increase the growth of the economy. None of them will argue that it isn't going to make us more able to compete effectively in export markets. None of them are going to argue that it won't keep jobs here. None of them are going to argue that it won't increase our capital accumulation here, which leads to more productivity, which leads to higher wages. Those arguments are not being made. So it's really a question of, can we prevail on these guys fast enough to do a real consumption tax and not fall prey to what the lobbyists want and many in D.C. want, which is some kind of false reform. That they know that if they do this, they are confident that our attention is going to get diverted somewhere else, and then they can put it back like they had it before.
Right.
Only they would love it if they could find a new revenue source, which would be a sales tax and an income tax.
Yep, that's what you got to look out for. That's why we've got to repeal the 16th Amendment.
I think we go for repealing the 16th, but the first thing we have to do is get the sales tax in effect, because and this I think is probably a legitimate concern. I've got a couple of people who I believe are true blue members who are for the sales tax. They really understand it. And both of them, though, said that they really don't think they're going to get many of their colleagues on board until you've actually seen the sales tax in operation for a year or two, to repealing the 16th.
Okay.
They really feel like that's if we can do that and show that it's working like we say it will be, and show that the people love it, which they will.
Yes. And the FAIRtax has a 7-year window
That's
for
right.
that to happen.
So we have time in that for it to work. But they feel like that the push would come after a year or two when everybody saw that it was going to work. And then we can repeal the 16th, and then we get lots of support.
Yeah, because if we don't repeal the 16th, this goes away that you've enjoyed for a while.
Yeah.
You mentioned a minute ago, and I'd like you to elaborate a bit on the somewhat cynical perception that people have of politicians, that they like the income tax, they like it exactly the way it is. The more complicated, the better, because it makes it easier for them to game the system for votes and profit. How accurate is that?
Well, I think it's very accurate. It's common that the most profitable lobbying activity to date, even though healthcare is starting to come up, but to date has been the tax code. And there are actually studies that show that that industries have spent $3 million lobbying Congress for a tax break that saved the industry $1 billion. So the return is incredible if they can get the right tax break. So they pay lots and lots of money to lobbyists. But see, it's not just to lobbyists. They fund PACs, political action committees. And those political action committees donate to members.
Yeah, those are the guys that are largely responsible for all the negative campaign ads you see.
Not only that, but all the positive ones, vote for Senator X because he's for whatever.
Yeah.
A lot of that money is coming from PACs. And those PACs are funded by lobbyists or lobbying interests, not just lobbyists. And a lot of that money is because they're asking, they're not giving the money because they think it's Christmas. They're giving the money because they want to get something back. And there is an understanding between a member, when he takes the money, that if he wants to get any more, he's going to have to be at least listening to that side. And a lot of times when you've got a budget in an economy like ours, $1 billion, not a big deal to just let it go by. But all of that adds up with all of these different members bringing this in. And so it is totally a problem. Ironically, and this is something that I think is really starting to dawn on some of these guys, it's not there yet, but the real control and the real lobbying benefits they're going to get is, even after the income tax is gone, the real question is how the money is spent. Do we allow monies to go to help fund research and blah, blah, blah?
Yeah.
To help that business develop a new milk processor or something. That's where the money is. So just reforming the tax system isn't necessarily going to handle lobbying by any means. We've had lobbying from the beginning of government. But what it does mean is that it's going to improve all of our lives. We're going to have a more vibrant economy. And we're going to have the ability to have our kids and our grandchildren, I just had a grandchild, see a country like I grew up in, which if it continues the way it is today, it's not going to be there.
Right.
You're going to have people who are starting to assume that life cannot be as good as it once was. And in truth, the income tax is creating a lot of that false illusion, because if they get rid of the income tax and let Americans produce like we know how to produce and compete like we know how to compete, we are going to have, once again, a country that's very much like when I grew up and my grandparents grew up, where you can do anything you want if you're willing to work.
So how do we make this happen? A lot of people, whether they think they're the good guys or the bad guys, they have to acknowledge that the NRA has got a tremendous amount of clout up there in Washington simply because of the huge membership that they've got.
Right.
What can we do to get our membership up, maybe not to that level, but to the level where we're going to have some clout up there?
Well, the way we're going to do that is two things. One is get the grassroots even more activated. It's activated now. When we get lots of people calling into Congress, a lot of people going to events, wearing T-shirts, wearing hats, doing that. That's working. We also need to get people like we've started the 1040 Club.
Yeah, the membership in AFFT is
right.
what I'm driving at.
Yep. And if we get people who are contributing $10.40 a month, for example, to AFFT, and you get 3,000 of those people, like Steve King, when he was asking me about the transition and how, because Steve is a big supporter of FAIRtax and has been for a long time. And I mentioned to him how we were getting more and more people to sign up, and he got really excited because he said most of the groups up here that claim to be grassroots are really funded by corporate interest.
Mm-hmm.
And he said if you have that many people helping fund your operations, that's tremendous. But if we get thousands of people doing that, what happens is we now have the money that we can expand out. For example, we've got an incredible opportunity now with the presidential primaries.
Mm-hmm.
In the Iowa caucus, you've got candidates coming into a house, your house, for example, to meet 25 of your neighbors.
Mm-hmm.
You've got an opportunity to have one of your neighbors there saying, Congressman, Governor, Senator, whatever you are, have you looked at the FAIRtax? Yes, I've looked at it, but I'm afraid that, it's blah, blah, blah. Well, Congressman, you're proposing a flat tax, is that right? Or Governor? Well, how do you know it's going to stay flat, Governor?
Mm-hmm.
How is that going to happen? Well, you've got an opportunity to have a conversation like we're having with Marco Rubio, with Scott Walker. And so it's really retail politics, as they call it, because you've got that. So if we get into Iowa and we start seeding these meetings with supporters who ask that question, it won't be long before they have to start coming up with a better answer, and FAIRtax becomes strongly in the mix. New Hampshire, in 92, I went to New Hampshire because I'd read a book about how easy it was to get in front of candidates because they go to small venues.
Mm-hmm.
And I went up there and recruited some people, and we had people that would go to these meetings. And every time they would go, they would ask if they were in favor of replacing the income tax and getting rid of the IRS with a retail sales tax. And initially, Clinton and Kerry and Zongas, all these guys sort of, it's the Gandhi thing. They ignore it and they kind of say, well, I don't think it'll work. And then they start saying, well, maybe it's bad because of this. By the end of the campaign, all of them were saying, well, it's actually an idea we should be looking at.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
We moved a little bit.
Yeah, we'd moved the needle. I mean, Bill Clinton came on I was doing a radio show in Berlin, New Hampshire, right before the primary. And the host had become a good supporter of consumption taxes, and he said, Clinton wants to be on, and he says, I want you to be on at the same time. He says, we're going to trap him. And so Clinton comes on and gives his little 2-minute pitch, of why you should vote for me. And he says, well, Governor, thanks so much for coming on. Now I want to introduce you to Steve Hayes. Steve happens to be from Arkansas, where you're governor, and he is proposing a tax system which I really think makes sense, and I'd like to get your opinion of. And Clinton, in his jovial way, says, "Oh, Steve, it's great you're from Arkansas," like that. And oh yeah, and I think it would be wonderful. What is it you're proposing? And I said, well, I'm proposing a retail sales tax, getting rid of the income tax. And he says, I've been looking at that, and I think it has a lot of positives. And he goes through the trade. I mean, he spent 5 minutes going through all the advantages of the retail sales tax. And that's because we were able to hammer him enough that his staff briefed him. Mm-hmm. Okay? He was up to it. Now, unfortunately, we didn't have the resources to continue that on, and it went on, and it kind of dropped out. But that's something we have, and if we get enough grassroots support, we can do two things. One is that AFFT can send some people up there and, like pay their hotels and pay their way. Mm-hmm. But we've got a lot of people who have supported FAIRtax in the past who will get back involved if they really see it's a grassroots activity. And how do they see it's a grassroots activity if the grassroots is funding the basic operation and you've got that support?
You be sure it's grassroots and not AstroTurf.
That's right.
Say.
That's right. Because it's so easy to say you've got 300,000 people on your mailing list, but they always ask you how many of them are contributing. Because it's the one who contributes.
Yeah, I was going to ask you how many
really is the one.
How many people you talk to in Washington, the first question out of their mouth is how many people are in your organization?
Well, a lot of times that doesn't come up the first question, but it will come up after they get to know you. Mm-hmm. They don't normally, and a lot of it's because we have lots of, like Paul Ryan. We don't have an organized operation in Wisconsin. But when I met with him, he said, I see your guys all the time. Because he sees people with the hats, with the T-shirts and all. And that's why he met with me. Mm-hmm. Okay? So and I don't dispel the idea that we have a lot of people. In fact, we promote the idea that we're everywhere. We're Fabian, we're all over. But a lot of people, like Steve King, asked me how many people are actually contributing. Because that's important to him. He thinks that we get up to that point where we have several thousand people actually contributing monthly, that's something he said I can use with my colleagues to let them know that this really is a grassroots group and this really makes a difference. And plus it'll help us bring in some of the wealthier people. I had a meeting with a gentleman with Jerry Moran and Rob Woodall in June. The man's net worth is over $1 billion. He's very interested in the FAIRtax.
Yeah, I'm hearing that there are wealthy people like that on the sidelines just waiting to see how much grassroots are going to be here before they jump in.
Are we really going to do what we say?
And your assessment of that is?
We're getting there. Yeah, every week we get more people who sign up for 1040. We get more people that join. And I think we're there. We just have to speed that up because Iowa's coming up in February. New Hampshire's in February. South Carolina is in February. Nevada is in February. They're like a week apart. Mm-hmm. And March 1st is the super primary where you have all these states, Florida and other states, which come in. So we have to speed that up because you can't show up January 15th and have an organization that's going to do this. We need to have people there in the fall when this really heats up and build our organizations up to where we can, in fact, have somebody sitting at the table when they come to the house and ask them the question. And if we do that, with Huckabee doing it, I mean, Trump, everybody's not sure what to think of. He says exactly what he thinks, whatever he wants to say it. But Trump was interviewed on MSNBC. And Trump was asked about the tax system. And he said, well, we got to do something. We got to do something really, really, I don't think he used the word radical, but a big change.
Really substantial change.
Yep. And he says, I don't know whether it's going to be the fair tax, which is what he said, or a flat tax, but it's got to be one of those.
Well,
so now
excellent.
you've got Donald Trump looking at this. Now, with all those Republican candidates, all of them out there, going to be looking to find a way to distinguish themselves, because a flat income tax is a flat income tax is a flat income tax.
Right.
You got Huckabee pounding the drum for the fair tax.
He's been doing that a long time, and Ted Cruz just signed on not long ago.
Ted Cruz is a co-sponsor. Ted is trying to walk both sides of the aisle, so to speak.
I've noticed that.
Yeah, but you've got Cruz, who's going to have to come up with something. You've got the attack that, like Rand Paul has. Rand Paul's got this flat tax. It's 14.5%. Well, first of all, he's got to get it through Congress. You know, what chance does he have of getting it through like it is? Probably almost zero. What chance does he have keeping it like he says he's going to do it? Probably almost zero. Why? Because it's feeding into a fight with all the special interests.
Mm-hmm.
Period. The sales tax, you eliminate all of that.
Yeah. And Herman Cain has kind of backed off his 999 and gone back to the fair tax.
He's back to the fair tax. Yep. He said, look, I don't need to do this. We need to go to the fair tax. And he told me, he says, look, 999 was only set up as a step to get to the fair tax.
Mm-hmm.
So that was my idea, was a step we could take. And once people saw it, we could then move on.
All right. Well, I wish you continued success in your lobbying efforts on behalf of the FAIRtax up there. Thank you for your service. You are welcome back on FAIRtax Power Radio anytime. Steve Hayes.
Thank you very much, Bob. Thanks for what you're doing. Did you get some?
And that is it. FAIRtax Power Radio's interview with Steve Hayes, President and Chairman of the Board of Americans for Fair Taxation. As he was mentioning, it is just critical that we make this happen, that we get into your membership with AFFT.
All right. I think you'll agree that there's maybe nobody more knowledgeable about taxation and the fair tax in general than Steve Hayes. And to get it to happen, well, we have a lot of volunteers across the country, here in Florida where Bob and I are, and all across the country. But what we need is people like you to join AFFT. Go to fairtax.org, become a member, and please make a donation. We need people. We need a lot of people to show the folks in Washington that we mean business, and we have a lot of folks behind us.
And we need donors to show the deep-pocketed guys who are sitting on the sidelines right now, making sure that this is going to be a viable movement. And if they do see that viability, they'll jump in with it as well, and that'll be a great help.
Yep. So your participation in this is critical. You don't have to become a volunteer and spend hours, doing it like but you can help us by going to the website and becoming a member and making a donation. So it really is critical. If you need to contact us, thefairtaxguys@gmail.com. Whatever your comments, positive, negative, whatever, do it. Send it. All right? Just send it along. And you can always listen to these programs on SoundCloud.com and YouTube. Just look for The FAIRtax Guys. So that about wraps it up,
Tell
right,
your
Bob?
friends and family and your in-laws and outlaws and whatever that they'd check out and become educated on the fair tax, because it's going to take every last one of us out here to make this happen.
It's important. It's important to learn about this.
Absolutely it is. Okay, well, that's just going to wrap it up here for this edition of FAIRtax Power Radio. Thank you again for listening. Again, we're on Facebook, we're on SoundCloud, we're on YouTube. Check us out in all three places if you would. TheFairtaxGuys@gmail.com, the email address. Until we meet again, Bob Paxton
and Ron Malero,
the FAIRtax Guys, reminding you that the fair tax, once you understand it,
you'll demand it.
Fair tax is coming. Don't